The vampire king stood in her kitchen doorway, watching Elena and Marcus blow out birthday candles with faces that mirrored his own. She'd faked her death to escape him, but the twins she'd raised in secret were living proof of the bond she could never truly sever. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched Elena's small fingers pulse with ethereal silver light, the same luminescence that had once danced across Lucian's skin during their most intimate moments 5 years ago. The child's touch grazed Lucian's pale hand, and his entire form seemed to solidify, as if her innocent contact had anchored him to this mundane kitchen in ways that centuries of power never could. Marcus peeked around Sarah's legs, his dark eyes wide with fascination and terror as he witnessed his sister's supernatural display, and Sarah realized with crushing certainty that her carefully constructed world of normalcy was crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Lucian's silver eyes never left Elena's glowing fingers, his expression shifting from predatory satisfaction to something resembling wonder. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of forgotten lullabies and royal bloodlines stretching back through millennia of darkness. "You have her mother's courage and my family's gift, little star," he murmured, using an endearment in the old tongue that Sarah remembered from whispered promises in castle chambers. And Elena giggled with delight, as if she understood the ancient words written into her very DNA. Sarah stepped protectively between them, her heart hammering against her ribs as she fought the urge to snatch both children and run, knowing that Lucian could catch them before they reached the front door. Knowing that running had only delayed this inevitable confrontation for 5 stolen years. The kitchen felt smaller now, compressed by the weight of supernatural tension and unspoken threats, the cheerful yellow walls and children's artwork seeming absurdly fragile against the backdrop of immortal politics and ancient claims. Marcus tugged at Sarah's sweater, his voice small and confused as he asked why the pretty man made Elena's hands light up like fireflies, and Sarah's throat closed with the impossibility of explaining that their father was a creature of legend, a king whose very existence challenged everything she had taught them about the world. Lucian crouched to Elena's eye level, his movements fluid as liquid shadow, and extended his own hand palm up in invitation, watching as the child's natural curiosity overcame any instinctive fear of the predator kneeling before her. When Elena placed her tiny palm against his, the silver light intensified, spreading up both their arms like living mercury, and Sarah saw Lucian's carefully maintained composure crack as 5 years of grief and longing crashed through his ancient defenses. He had mourned her, she realized with a stab of guilt that cut deeper than any physical wound, had believed, himself widowed and his bloodline severed, had spent half a decade in the special hell reserved for immortal creatures who lose their mates. The thought should have brought satisfaction, some measure of justice for the cage he had built around her love, but instead it only deepened her understanding of how thoroughly she had shattered both their lives in her desperate bid for freedom. Marcus moved closer, drawn by the magical display despite his wariness, and when his small hand joined the connection, the entire kitchen filled with warm silver radiance that made the ordinary appliances and family photos seem like artifacts from another realm entirely. Sarah watched her children discover their heritage through touch, saw recognition bloom in their innocent faces, as they felt the pull of bloodlines and ancient power that no amount of human upbringing could fully suppress, and knew that the careful barriers she had built between them and their supernatural legacy were dissolving like sugar in rain. Lucian's eyes met hers over the children's heads, and in their depths, she saw not just the vampire king who had once ruled her heart and her choices, but a father meeting his children for the first time, overwhelmed by love and loss and the terrible responsibility of protecting something more precious than kingdoms or immortality. Elena asked in her clear, innocent voice if he was like the princes in her storybooks, and Lucian's laugh was both beautiful and heartbreaking as he told her he was something much older and far more complicated than any fairy tale hero. Marcus, emboldened by his sister's fearlessness, asked if that meant they were like princesses and princes too, And Sarah's carefully rehearsed explanations about normal families and ordinary lives crumbled entirely as she faced the truth that her children had never been normal, could never be ordinary, were born to inherit powers and responsibilities that she had tried desperately to deny. The silver light began to fade as the children's concentration wavered, but the connection remained, visible in the way Elena leaned toward Lucian with unconscious trust, and the way Marcus studied this stranger who somehow felt familiar as breathing. Lucian rose slowly, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face, and she saw in his expression the patient certainty of a creature who had learned to measure time in centuries rather than moments, who knew that tonight had changed everything, and that there would be no more running, no more hiding, no more pretending that love and blood and ancient oaths could be escaped through false deaths and new identities. The vampire king had found his queen and his heirs, and Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that the next choice she made would determine not just her children's future, but the fate of supernatural bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of civilization itself. Elena yawned, the magical exertion exhausting her small frame, and asked if the pretty man would stay for dinner like the other grown-ups sometimes did, her innocent question carrying implications that made Sarah's chest tight with panic and desperate longing. Marcus nodded eagerly, adding that they were having spaghetti and that Mama made the best garlic bread, his casual invitation to the vampire king causing Lucian's lips to curve in genuine amusement for the first time since he had materialized in their doorway like a beautiful nightmare made flesh. Sarah looked at her children, flushed and happy from their first taste of their true heritage. Then at Lucian, patient and powerful, and offering her choices that felt more like elegant threats, wrapped in silk and starlight. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking mortal time in a space now touched by immortal power, and Sarah realized that 5 years of borrowed time had finally run out. That the reckoning she had feared and postponed and tried to prevent had arrived, wearing the face of the only man she had ever loved and the only monster she had ever fled. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The memory struck Sarah like lightning as she watched Lucian's eyes flash crimson at the scent of Elena's blood, transporting her back 7 years to a lecture hall at Portland State University, where she had been a graduate student, researching medieval architectural symbolism, and he had been the guest speaker who changed her entire world with a single glance across crowded seats filled with eager academics. She had been 24 then, dedicated to her studies and passionate about uncovering the mysteries hidden in ancient stone carvings and Gothic cathedral designs, completely unprepared for the sophisticated stranger in an expensive charcoal suit who spoke about 13th century building techniques with the authority of someone who had witnessed their creation firsthand. Lucian had been magnificent even then, his silver eyes holding depths that seemed to contain centuries of knowledge, his voice carrying subtle accents from a dozen different eras as he described flying buttresses and rose windows with intimate familiarity that made the academic audience lean forward in fascination. After his lecture, he had approached her during the reception, drawn by her insightful questions about the symbolic meanings embedded in cathedral architecture, and their conversation had flowed like wine as she shared her theories about hidden messages in stone, while he offered perspectives that seemed impossibly well-informed. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of elegant dinners in restaurants she could never afford, weekend trips to examine actual medieval structures across Europe, and conversations that stretched through entire nights as he seemed genuinely fascinated by her modern academic perspective on historical periods he discussed as if he had lived through them. She had fallen completely and utterly in love with his mysterious wealth, his encyclopedic knowledge of history, his ability to make her feel like the most brilliant woman in the world when she shared her research discoveries. never questioning how a man who appeared to be in his early 30s could possess such intimate knowledge of architectural techniques that predated written records. The proposal had come during a moonlit visit to a restored castle in Scotland, where he had knelt among ancient stones and offered her a ring that contained a sapphire older than the building around them, speaking of eternal love and binding their souls together in words that seemed lifted from medieval poetry. Their wedding had been small, intimate, held in a private chapel that belonged to his family, and she had been so consumed with love and the fairy tale romance of marrying into old-world aristocracy that she had barely noticed the strange, formal language of the ceremony or the way the officiant's eyes gleamed with inhuman light in the candlelit sanctuary. The wedding night had shattered her human understanding of reality when Lucian revealed the truth about his nature, about the world that existed in shadows alongside the mundane human realm, about the ancient bloodlines and supernatural politics that governed more of civilization than mortals ever suspected. He had been gentle in his revelation, showing her his true form gradually, letting her touch the marble perfection of his skin and see the predatory grace in his movements before explaining that she was now queen to a vampire court that stretched across continents and controlled vast networks of power, both supernatural and mundane. The vampire world had been overwhelming in its complexity and beauty and terrible efficiency, a society where immortal beings maintained strict hierarchies based on age and bloodline strength, while secretly influencing human governments, financial systems, and cultural movements through carefully placed agents and centuries of accumulated wealth and knowledge. As Lucian's queen, she had been expected to learn the intricate protocols of court politics, to serve as a bridge between vampire nobility and their human assets, to eventually produce heirs who would carry royal blood into the next generation and strengthen the ancient bloodlines that maintained supernatural order. The castle that became her new home had been magnificent and terrifying, filled with immortal courtiers who bowed to her position while calculating how to use her human connections for their own advantage, where children barely past their first century of life were trained in assassination techniques and political manipulation alongside classical languages and courtly arts. She had tried to adapt, had genuinely believed she could find her place in this supernatural aristocracy, but the executions, disguised as accidents, had begun wearing away her moral foundations as she watched Lucian order deaths with the casual efficiency of a king managing his realm. The breaking point had come during a court gathering where she witnessed a rival vampire's child, barely 16 in appearance, but actually 40 years old, calmly poison a human diplomat's wine while discussing Renaissance poetry, and she realized that the beautiful monsters surrounding her viewed human life as currency to be spent in their endless games of power and influence. When she discovered she was pregnant 6 months into their marriage, her joy had been immediately overshadowed by the court's reaction as ancient vampires spoke excitedly about the rarity of hybrid children and their potential as weapons in supernatural conflicts that had raged since before recorded history. Victor, Lucian's younger brother and closest advisor, had been particularly interested in the pregnancy, visiting frequently to discuss the twins' future training and their role in strengthening the royal bloodline against challenges from other vampire courts across the globe. She had initially been naive enough to believe that her children could grow up normally within the supernatural world, that their hybrid nature might allow them more choices than pure vampire offspring. But listening to Victor's plans for their education had revealed the truth about their intended destiny. The twins would be raised as perfect weapons, trained from infancy to manipulate both human and vampire societies, groomed to expand their father's influence through a combination of supernatural abilities and political cunning that would make them invaluable assets in the eternal struggle for dominance among immortal bloodlines. The final revelation had come when she overheard Victor discussing his coup plans with supporters, detailing how the hybrid twins could be used to unite fractured vampire factions under his leadership by demonstrating that royal blood could successfully bridge the gap between supernatural and human worlds. He had been planning to eliminate Lucian shortly after the children's birth, using Sarah's grief and inexperience to manipulate her into supporting his claim to power while raising Elena and Marcus as his own weapons of conquest. The escape plan had formed in her mind with desperate clarity as she realized that remaining in the vampire world meant condemning her unborn children to lives as pawns in immortal power struggles that would strip away any chance of choosing their own destinies or experiencing the simple human joys she remembered from her own childhood. She had used her academic research skills to create a false identity, carefully establishing Sarah Chen as a displaced graduate student whose records could withstand casual scrutiny while planning her death in meticulous detail to ensure no vampire would ever suspect her survival. The car explosion during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic trip to negotiate territory boundaries had been terrifyingly real, and she had barely escaped the flames that consumed her old identity, along with any trace of DNA evidence that might have revealed her survival to supernatural senses. The 5 years since had been built on guilt and love in equal measure, as she raised Elena and Marcus in blessed ignorance of their royal heritage, while knowing that every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story was stolen time that would inevitably run out when their father's grief turned to suspicion and supernatural resources located his missing heirs. Now, watching Lucian's protective instincts flare at the scent of Elena's blood from her small cut on the broken toy, Sarah saw the terrible irony that her attempt to save her children from becoming weapons had only delayed their initiation into a world where love and violence intertwined like silver chains. Elena's empathic abilities were growing stronger by the day, allowing her to sense the emotional turmoil radiating from the adults around her, while Marcus had begun phasing partially out of visible existence whenever he felt threatened or overwhelmed, both children displaying the hybrid powers that made them so valuable to vampire politics. Lucian knelt beside Elena, his vampiric nature fully visible now as his canines extended and his skin took on the marble luminescence that marked his true form. Yet his touch remained gentle as he examined her small wound with the careful attention of a father, discovering his protective instincts for the first time. Sarah found herself moving toward them, her own parental instincts overriding 5 years of fear as she saw her daughter's fascination with the beautiful monster who was her father. Marcus creeping closer, despite his wariness, as he sensed the genuine love emanating from the supernatural stranger who shared their unusual abilities. The moment crystallized everything she had tried to prevent and everything she had hoped to preserve, as her children encountered their vampire heritage through their father's protective love rather than the calculated manipulation she had fled, and Sarah realized that perhaps the greatest danger had never been Lucian himself, but the world that surrounded him, and the choice she now faced between continuing to run or standing and fighting for her children's right to know their father without becoming weapons in supernatural wars they were too young to understand. The arrival of Seraphina 3 days later shattered the fragile peace that had settled over Sarah's suburban sanctuary like a blade through gossamer, her ethereal beauty and predatory grace making the cheerful neighborhood seem suddenly exposed and vulnerable to forces that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Sarah recognized her immediately from the kitchen window as the vampire lieutenant glided up the front walkway with inhuman fluidity, her platinum hair catching afternoon sunlight like spun silver while her ancient eyes surveyed the modest human dwelling with the calculating assessment of a general planning a siege. Seraphina had been Lucian's most trusted advisor for over 3 centuries, a creature of deadly elegance who could dismember enemies with ballet-like precision while discussing court protocols in a voice like poisoned honey. And her presence in Oregon meant that the vampire world's attention had fully focused on Sarah's stolen children. The doorbell's cheerful chime seemed obscenely normal as Sarah opened the door to face the immortal courtier, who had once been her closest ally in navigating supernatural politics, back when she had believed she could find her place among creatures who measured morality in centuries rather than moments. Seraphina's smile was sharp as winter starlight as she glided into the living room without invitation, her designer clothing and flawless makeup a stark contrast to the family photos and children's toys scattered across surfaces that spoke of mortal concerns like homework and bedtime stories. Victor has discovered their survival, she announced without preamble, her melodious voice carrying undertones that made the houseplants wilt slightly as supernatural power pressed against the domestic space. He is mobilizing the traditional factions who believe hybrid children represent contamination of pure bloodlines, and several court nobles are supporting his claim for immediate custody based on ancient laws that supersede any human legal protections. Sarah felt her carefully constructed world tilting as she processed the implications. Knowing that vampire politics operated on scales of power and precedent that rendered human courts meaningless when supernatural bloodlines were at stake. Elena and Marcus were at school, safely distant from this confrontation for now. But Sarah could already envision how their normal childhood routines would crumble under the weight of immortal attention and ancient obligations that cared nothing for 5-year-old birthday parties or kindergarten art projects. Seraphina continued with clinical precision, explaining that Victor's supporters viewed Sarah as an aberration who had corrupted royal blood through her human weakness, arguing that the twins needed immediate removal from mortal influence before their hybrid nature became permanently tainted by mundane concerns. The court was divided, she admitted, with some nobles supporting Lucian's patient approach, while others demanded swift action to secure the children's vampire heritage before they grew too attached to human limitations. Vampire law was frustratingly clear on the matter, Seraphina noted with something resembling sympathy. Royal offspring belonged to the court from birth, and Sarah's deception had merely delayed the inevitable reckoning that would determine Elena and Marcus's future within supernatural hierarchy. As if summoned by the discussion of legal precedents, neighbors began appearing at strategic intervals. Mrs. Patterson from next door walking her dog past the front window 3 times in 10 minutes, while Mr. Chen across the street found sudden reasons to check his mailbox repeatedly. Sarah realized with growing horror that Seraphina's presence was affecting the entire neighborhood, her supernatural aura causing humans to feel inexplicably drawn to investigate while remaining unaware of the ancient predator in their midst. The situation deteriorated further when Elena and Marcus returned from school, their backpacks heavy with the normal concerns of children who had no idea their heritage included centuries of bloodshed and political maneuvering disguised as courtly elegance. Elena's empathic abilities immediately detected the tension radiating from the adults, her small face scrunching with concentration as she tried to process emotions too complex for her young mind to fully understand, while Marcus began phasing in and out of visibility as stress triggered his defensive instincts. Seraphina watched the children with professional interest, cataloging their developing abilities with the same attention she might give to weapons being evaluated for battlefield effectiveness. And Sarah felt sick realizing that Elena's innocent questions and Marcus's shy behavior were being assessed through the lens of supernatural utility rather than parental affection. The twins' abilities were manifesting more frequently now, Elena accidentally reading her teacher's private thoughts during story time, and Marcus unconsciously influencing classmates to share their lunches when he forgot his own, creating incidents that would eventually attract unwanted attention from authorities who investigated unusual occurrences. Sarah found herself caught between the impossible choice of running again and condemning her children to lives as perpetual fugitives, or standing to fight against vampire courts that had existed since before human civilization and commanded resources that spanned continents and centuries. The decision crystallized 2 days later when Victor himself arrived with a retinue of ancient nobles, transforming Sarah's quiet suburban street into a supernatural battleground, disguised as a diplomatic visit that left neighbors mysteriously compelled to remain indoors while immortal politics played out behind cheerful yellow curtains and family photographs. Victor had changed little in 5 years, still possessing the cruel beauty that marked ancient vampire bloodlines, while his eyes held the cold calculation of a creature who viewed mortals as pawns in games that stretched across millennia. He swept into Sarah's living room like a conquering prince, his expensive suit and predatory grace making the domestic space seem suddenly shabby and vulnerable as he examined family photos with the detached interest of a collector appraising acquisitions. The nobles accompanying him treated Sarah with barely concealed contempt, ancient creatures who had ruled supernatural territories since before the Renaissance, and viewed her hybrid children as fascinating specimens contaminated by mortal weakness that needed immediate correction through proper vampire education. Victor's smile was sharp as broken glass as he settled into Sarah's favorite armchair, his presence filling the room with an aura of barely restrained violence that made the houseplants wither and caused small electronic devices to malfunction throughout the building. "You have hidden my brother's heirs well," he admitted with mocking approval. "But vampire blood calls to vampire blood, and their supernatural signatures are becoming too strong to conceal from those who know how to look for royal lineage." His revelation that he had discovered Sarah's research into ancient vampire laws struck her like a physical blow, realizing that her academic knowledge of supernatural history had been both blessing and curse, providing escape routes while also making her a threat to established power structures. The traditional courts feared her discovery of the crown of choice statute, Victor explained with predatory satisfaction, because it challenged the absolute authority that kept vampire society stable through rigid hierarchy and unquestioned bloodline supremacy. Sarah's scholarly investigation into forgotten laws represented dangerous precedent that could inspire other supernatural subjects to question ancient traditions, and her continued existence posed risks that extended far beyond simple custody disputes. Lucian arrived as tensions reached breaking point, his supernatural senses detecting the threat to his family from blocks away as he materialized in Sarah's kitchen with the lethal grace of apex predator protecting his territory. The confrontation between brothers filled the house with crackling energy that made the air itself feel heavy and dangerous. Centuries of rivalry and political disagreement crystallizing into a supernatural standoff that could reshape vampire courts or destroy them entirely. Elena and Marcus huddled together on the stairs, their young minds overwhelmed by the emotional intensity radiating from immortal creatures whose conflicts predated human civilization, and Sarah realized that her children were witnessing their first glimpse of the beautiful violence that defined vampire existence. Victor's supporters moved with choreographed precision, positioning themselves throughout the house like chess pieces while maintaining the pretense of diplomatic courtesy, their ancient eyes cataloging escape routes and tactical advantages as they prepared for potential conflict. The supernatural tension became unbearable when Elena demanded answers in her clear young voice, asking why the pretty people were angry and why everyone felt scary even when they smiled nicely. Sarah found herself facing the moment she had dreaded for 5 years, as she knelt before her children and began explaining their heritage, their father's true nature, and the reason she had faked her death to give them normal childhoods. Elena's reaction was immediate fascination as she processed the revelation that she was a vampire princess with magical powers, her young mind embracing the fairy tale aspects while remaining innocent of the darker implications. Marcus recoiled in terror, sensing the violence and control that permeated vampire society, even when wrapped in elegant courtesies, his empathic abilities picking up on the predatory nature that lurked beneath beautiful faces and sophisticated manners. The split in their reactions created immediate complications, as vampire tradition demanded that royal twins rule together in harmony, while Elena and Marcus were developing conflicting loyalties that threatened the very foundation of their supernatural heritage. Victor's supporters recognized the opportunity presented by the children's division, arguing that proper vampire education could correct the damage caused by human upbringing while ensuring their loyalty to court traditions. The debate escalated into supernatural conflict when Victor's most militant supporter made the mistake of reaching for Elena to demonstrate vampire authority, triggering protective instincts in both Sarah and Lucian that transformed the living room into battlefield. The attack came without warning as ancient vampires moved with inhuman speed, their elegant facades dropping to reveal predators who had survived centuries through calculated violence disguised as political necessity. Sarah watched in fascination and horror as Lucian and his loyal guards engaged Victor's supporters in combat that was both beautiful and terrifying, supernatural strength and grace, creating deadly choreography that left deep gouges in hardwood floors and shattered family photographs. Elena and Marcus witnessed their first taste of real vampire warfare as immortal creatures fought with elegant brutality, their movements too fast for human eyes to follow while the house shook under impacts that would have killed mortals instantly. The battle ended as quickly as it began when Victor called for withdrawal, recognizing that direct confrontation in human territory carried risks that outweighed potential gains, but not before Elena and Marcus had seen exactly what their heritage truly meant in terms of power and violence. Sarah held her traumatized children as supernatural enemies departed with promises that this dispute would be settled through proper channels, knowing that Victor's retreat was tactical rather than defeat, and that the real war for Elena and Marcus's future was only beginning. The silence following Victor's departure hung heavy in Sarah's damaged living room, like smoke from ancient funeral pyres, broken only by Elena's quiet sniffling and Marcus's barely audible whimpers as they clung to their mother while processing the violent revelation of their supernatural heritage. Sarah surveyed the destruction with clinical detachment, noting the splintered coffee table, the deep gouges in hardwood floors where vampire claws had found purchase during combat, and the family photographs scattered like confetti across surfaces that no longer felt safe or familiar. Lucian stood motionless near the shattered front window, his predatory stillness radiating the controlled fury of an apex predator who had watched enemies threaten his offspring, while Serafina efficiently cataloged the tactical disadvantages of defending human territory against coordinated vampire assault. The weight of unspoken decisions pressed against Sarah's consciousness as she realized that this suburban sanctuary had become untenable, that Victor's retreat was merely strategic withdrawal rather than defeat, and that the next confrontation would likely determine her children's fate through channels far more dangerous than direct combat. Elena lifted her tear-streaked face to study her mother with newfound wariness, her empathic abilities detecting the layers of deception and hidden knowledge that had shaped their entire relationship, while Marcus remained pressed against Sarah's side with the desperate intensity of a child who sensed that everything familiar was dissolving around him. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring until Sarah made her choice, the words emerging from depths of academic research and desperate maternal calculation that had sustained her through 5 years of careful deception. "There is another way," she announced quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying supernatural law in search of escape routes that ancient vampires had forgotten or deliberately buried. Lucian's silver eyes fixed on her with laser intensity as she explained her discovery of the Crown of Choice, an archaic statute that predated most current vampire courts and offered royal children of mixed heritage the unprecedented right to determine their own supernatural destiny through formal trial when they reached the age of 7. The law had been enacted during an era when vampire courts struggled with succession disputes involving hybrid offspring, Sarah continued with growing confidence, but had been quietly suppressed by traditional factions who recognized its threat to established bloodline hierarchy and absolute royal authority. Serafina's sharp intake of breath confirmed the significance of this revelation, her ancient knowledge recognizing legal precedent that could reshape fundamental assumptions about vampire governance and hereditary power. The Crown of Choice had never been formally repealed, Sarah emphasized, meaning it remained technically valid despite centuries of disuse, and Elena and Marcus would be eligible to invoke its protections in less than 2 years when they reached the required age. Lucian's expression shifted through several complex emotions as he processed the implications, his paternal instincts warring with royal expectations, while recognizing that Sarah's academic discovery offered possibilities that pure political maneuvering could never achieve. This revelation reframed everything they had assumed about the current crisis, transforming Sarah's desperate flight from simple maternal protection into calculated strategic positioning that had given the twins crucial time to develop individual identities before being forced into predetermined supernatural roles. The law required that eligible children be raised with knowledge of both worlds before making their choice, Sarah explained while watching Lucian's internal struggle play out across his immortal features, meaning that Elena and Marcus would need exposure to vampire culture and training while maintaining their human connections. Victor's faction would inevitably move to prevent the law's invocation, she continued, arguing that half-human children lacked the purity and strength to be trusted with vampire royal power, which meant the coming conflict would extend far beyond simple custody disputes into fundamental questions about supernatural governance and bloodline supremacy. Lucian finally spoke, his voice carrying centuries of royal authority, tempered by newfound paternal uncertainty, as he acknowledged the wisdom in Sarah's approach, while grappling with his own desires for heirs who could strengthen and continue his ancient bloodline. The discussion was interrupted by Elena's clear young voice, asking what the scary people wanted with her and Marcus. Her innocent question, highlighting the gap between adult political maneuvering and childish comprehension of forces that would shape their entire future. Sarah knelt beside her children, choosing her words carefully as she explained that some vampires believed they should grow up learning only supernatural ways, while others thought they should be allowed to choose for themselves when they were older and wiser. Marcus emerged from his protective silence to ask if they had to leave their home and friends, his small voice breaking Sarah's heart as she realized how thoroughly the supernatural conflict had already disrupted the normal childhood she had tried so desperately to preserve. The conversation was cut short by Seraphina's urgent warning that Victor's supporters were mobilizing throughout the region, using their extensive networks to systematically undermine Sarah's human identity and legal standing while positioning themselves for more direct action. Within hours, Sarah began receiving calls from her school district questioning her background check discrepancies, her bank freezing accounts due to suspicious activity flags, and neighbors reporting strange incidents that would soon attract federal investigation into the supernatural disturbances surrounding her household. Victor's faction was methodically destroying the foundations of her mortal existence, Lucian observed, with grim admiration for his brother's tactical efficiency, forcing them to choose between abandoning human territory entirely or standing to fight on ground increasingly unfavorable to their position. The supernatural Cold War intensified over the following days as Lucian's loyal supporters arrived to establish protective perimeters around Sarah's neighborhood, their presence causing subtle but noticeable changes in local atmosphere as immortal predators took positions disguised as ordinary residents and service workers. Elena and Marcus found themselves caught between worlds as their abilities manifested more frequently under stress, Elena accidentally projecting her emotions onto classmates during reading circle, while Marcus phased through solid walls when overwhelmed by supernatural tensions he couldn't fully understand. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that her children needed training to control their developing powers regardless of their eventual choice, and that such education would require cooperation with the vampire court she had spent 5 years trying to escape. Lucian approached this necessity with careful patience, beginning the twins' supernatural education through games and stories that introduced basic concepts while respecting their young minds and human sensibilities. Elena embraced these lessons with enthusiasm that reminded Sarah painfully of her own fascination with historical mysteries, while Marcus remained wary, but gradually warmed to the father figure who treated him with gentle respect rather than the demanding authority he had feared. The training sessions revealed the depth of the children's hybrid nature as they demonstrated abilities that surpassed both human limitations and typical vampire offspring, their unique heritage creating possibilities that neither pure bloodlines could achieve independently. As external pressures mounted and supernatural politics invaded every aspect of their daily existence, Sarah found herself forced into closer cooperation with Lucian than she had experienced since their marriage, their shared concern for Elena and Marcus, creating reluctant alliance that slowly began bridging 5 years of separation and betrayal. Working together to protect their children revealed how much both had changed during their separation, Sarah developing fierce independence and survival instincts, while Lucian had learned to temper his royal authority with paternal tenderness that transformed his approach to power and responsibility. The forced proximity began rekindling emotions that neither could afford to acknowledge while their children's safety remained uncertain. But the attraction and understanding that had originally drawn them together proved stronger than political necessity or supernatural duty. Their relationship reached a critical point when Victor's supporters launched a coordinated magical attack designed to overwhelm the children's developing defenses and force them into supernatural submission that would bypass legal protections entirely. The assault came during Elena's 6th birthday celebration, transforming Sarah's carefully planned party into a battlefield where ancient magic clashed against parental protection, while innocent children cowered under forces beyond mortal comprehension. Lucian's defensive abilities proved insufficient against the coordinated attack from multiple vampire sorcerers, leaving only one option that required Sarah's willing participation in blood magic that would temporarily restore their severed mate bond and combine their protective powers. The ritual demanded complete trust and emotional vulnerability from both parents as they allowed their consciousness to merge through shared blood, experiencing 5 years of separation, grief, and desperate love in moments that felt like lifetimes of compressed emotion. Sarah experienced Lucian's agonizing mourning process, his near madness from believing his beloved mate had died, and his gradual reconstruction of purpose around governing vampire courts that no longer held personal meaning without her presence. Lucian felt Sarah's terror during her escape, her constant fear of discovery, and her daily struggle to provide normal childhood experiences while suppressing her own supernatural nature to protect their children from the world that had created them. The blood bond revealed truths that words could never convey, showing how their love had survived 5 years of separation and deception, while demonstrating that their connection transcended political necessity or supernatural obligation. Together, their combined power created a protective barrier that deflected Victor's magical assault, while establishing new understanding between former mates who had rediscovered their fundamental compatibility despite everything that had driven them apart. The aftermath left them emotionally raw and physically exhausted, but their children were safe, and their relationship had evolved into something deeper than their original marriage, tempered by loss and strengthened by shared sacrifice for Elena and Marcus's future. The successful defense proved that they were stronger together than apart, but both recognized that their personal feelings must remain secondary to their children's welfare until the Crown of Choice trial could provide legal resolution to the supernatural custody dispute, threatening to destroy everything they had fought to preserve. The vampire world fractured like ancient glass under the pressure of Sarah's revelation about the Crown of Choice, centuries of established hierarchy trembling as immortal nobles chose sides in a conflict that would reshape supernatural law and bloodline politics for generations to come. News of the forgotten statute spread through vampire courts across continents with the speed of wildfire, carried by supernatural communication networks that had operated in shadows since before human civilization recorded its first laws. Ancient vampires who had slumbered through decades of routine governance awakened to debate legal precedents that predated their own existence, while younger immortals saw opportunity to challenge traditions that had kept them bound to rigid social structures for centuries. Sarah found herself at the center of a supernatural storm that extended far beyond custody disputes. As vampire scholars emerged from hidden libraries to examine dusty legal codes that might contain other forgotten rights and forgotten freedoms buried beneath layers of traditional interpretation. The first unexpected ally arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in the form of Countess Isabelle Montclair, a French vampire who appeared to be no older than 30, but whose tired eyes held the weight of 4 centuries spent navigating court politics that demanded absolute conformity to bloodline purity standards. Isabel entered Sarah's damaged home with the quiet desperation of someone seeking sanctuary rather than conquest, her elegant composure cracking as she revealed her own secret burden of raising a half-human daughter in careful isolation from vampire society that would condemn both mother and child for contaminating pure bloodlines. The Countess had hidden little Celeste for 15 years, she explained, while watching Elena and Marcus play with supernatural abilities that her own daughter had been forced to suppress completely, creating a false identity and elaborate deception network that made Sarah's 5-year charade seem simple by comparison. Other hidden families began emerging from supernatural shadows as word spread through vampire underground networks that had operated for centuries to protect those who failed to meet court standards of purity and traditional power. Parents who had chosen love over bloodline politics and faced exile or execution if discovered by traditionalist factions. Sarah realized with growing amazement that her desperate choice to protect Elena and Marcus had inadvertently created a rallying point for vampires who questioned the rigid hierarchy that demanded sacrifice of personal happiness for political necessity and bloodline supremacy. Lord Nathaniel Cross arrived from the London courts with documentation proving that at least 17 vampire nobles currently held positions of power despite having hidden human ancestry that would disqualify them under strict interpretation of purity laws. His revelation sending shockwaves through political networks that depended on absolute bloodline authority. The growing coalition faced fierce opposition from traditional factions, led by Victor and supported by ancient vampires, whose power depended entirely on maintaining existing social structures that elevated pure bloodlines above all other considerations. Elder Morgana Blackthorn, whose vampire lineage stretched back to pre-Roman times, declared Sarah's discovery of the crown of choice to be heretical interpretation of laws that were never intended to apply to modern supernatural governance. The conflict intensified when Elena and Marcus began displaying abilities that transcended anything previously recorded in vampire history, their hybrid nature creating possibilities that threatened fundamental assumptions about supernatural power and bloodline inheritance. Elena's empathic abilities evolved beyond simple emotion detection into direct manipulation of the mystical bonds that connected vampires to their makers, their territories, and their courts, essentially granting her the power to reshape vampire society from within by severing or strengthening supernatural connections at will. Marcus demonstrated even more alarming capabilities when he began temporarily granting human allies vampire-like strength, speed, and sensory enhancement through direct contact, creating the possibility of human-vampire hybrid armies that could challenge traditional power structures completely. These unprecedented abilities made the twins invaluable strategic assets, while simultaneously marking them as existential threats to vampire courts that had maintained control for millennia through careful regulation of supernatural power distribution among bloodlines. Sarah watched her children develop into living weapons of social revolution, while Victor's supporters argued that such dangerous abilities proved the contamination of human blood created unstable mutations that endangered vampire civilization itself. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Elena accidentally revealed her teacher Mrs. Henderson's carefully hidden gambling addiction to the entire faculty during a routine parent conference, her empathic powers projecting private thoughts with enough clarity to destroy professional relationships and personal reputations. Marcus's incident during school recess proved even more catastrophic when he phased through the gymnasium wall while being chased during dodgeball. His supernatural escape witnessed by 12 parents, who immediately began demanding explanations for impossible phenomena their children described with frightening accuracy. Sarah realized with growing horror that her attempts to maintain normal human lives for Elena and Marcus had become impossible as their abilities grew stronger and less controllable under the stress of supernatural politics that followed them everywhere they went. Federal agencies began investigating the unusual incidents plaguing the small Oregon town, their systematic approach and advanced technology posing new threats that neither vampire courts nor human deception could easily deflect or eliminate. Agent Rebecca Torres from the Department of Homeland Security arrived with recording equipment and witness testimonies that documented supernatural phenomena with scientific precision, her investigation threatening to expose vampire society to government scrutiny that could destroy centuries of carefully maintained secrecy. Sarah faced the impossible choice between exposing her children to vampire politics that might consume them or watching their continued presence in human society destroy innocent people through supernatural incidents they could no longer prevent or explain. The decision crystallized when Elena accidentally influenced her kindergarten classmates to share their deepest fears during story time, creating mass psychological trauma that required professional counseling and raised questions about environmental contamination or unknown psychological warfare experiments. Marcus's growing ability to grant temporary vampire powers to human friends resulted in playground incidents where 5-year-olds demonstrated inhuman strength and speed that left other children injured and parents demanding immediate investigation by federal authorities. Sarah's teaching career ended abruptly when school officials discovered discrepancies in her background check that federal investigators had flagged as potential security risks, her carefully constructed identity crumbling under scrutiny that revealed layers of deception extending back to her faked death 5 years earlier. The human world she had tried desperately to preserve for her children was actively rejecting them. Their supernatural nature, incompatible with mortal institutions designed around human limitations and normal psychological development. Under mounting pressure from all supernatural factions and faced with federal investigation that threatened to expose vampire society completely, the High Council of Vampire Courts agreed to convene formal hearings on the Crown of Choice statute and its application to Elena and Marcus's unique situation. The announcement came through official channels that had not been used for legal proceedings of this magnitude since the vampire civil wars of the 18th century, when competing bloodlines had nearly destroyed supernatural civilization through unrestrained political violence. Sarah learned that the trial would take place in the Obsidian Palace, the ancient seat of vampire power hidden in the Swiss Alps, where the oldest and most powerful immortals maintained their courts away from human observation and interference. The location itself carried symbolic weight as neutral territory where vampire law superseded all other considerations, including human legal protections and international sovereignty that normally shielded supernatural refugees from court jurisdiction. Lucian offered Sarah his protection during the proceedings, but both understood that vampire law operated through complex traditions that valued precedent and political power over simple justice or parental rights that humans might consider fundamental. The formal invitation carried ceremonial language that had remained unchanged for over 1,000 years, requiring Sarah to present herself as petitioner rather than defendant, while acknowledging vampire court authority over matters involving royal bloodlines and supernatural inheritance. Elena's reaction to news of their departure was immediate excitement as she viewed the upcoming trial as a grand adventure that would finally allow her to see the magical world her father had described through stories and training sessions. She packed her favorite books about princesses and magic alongside the practical clothing Sarah recommended, her innocent enthusiasm a stark contrast to the political machinations and potential violence that surrounded their situation. Marcus withdrew further into himself as departure approached, his empathic abilities detecting the fear and tension radiating from every adult involved in their supernatural crisis, while his young mind struggled to process the implications of leaving everything familiar behind. Sarah spent sleepless nights preparing legal arguments based on historical precedent and constitutional interpretation of vampire law, knowing that her academic research skills represented their best hope for navigating court politics that had evolved over centuries of bloodshed and political compromise. The final evening in their suburban home carried the weight of permanent goodbye as Sarah packed family photographs and children's artwork that represented 5 years of carefully constructed normalcy that might never be recovered regardless of the trial's outcome. Neighbors watched through curtained windows as expensive black cars arrived to escort the family toward their supernatural destiny, the human world they left behind already beginning to forget the unusual incidents and impossible phenomena that had marked their presence through selective memory. Modification performed by vampire agents. The last image Sarah carried from their mortal life was Mrs. Patterson waving goodbye from her front yard, her kind face expressing confused concern for neighbors she had never really known, but had grown to care about through small daily interactions that represented everything Sarah valued about human community and connection. The drive toward Obsidian Palace took them through increasingly remote mountain roads where human civilization gradually gave way to wilderness that had remained unchanged since vampire courts first established their ancient seat of power in territory that existed outside normal national boundaries. Elena pressed her face against car windows to watch snow-covered peaks and dark forests that seemed to whisper with supernatural energy, while Marcus huddled closer to Sarah as they traveled deeper into a world where their hybrid nature would determine not just their own futures, but potentially reshape vampire civilization for generations to come. The Obsidian Palace materialized from alpine mist, like a fever dream carved from living shadow and ancient stone, its towering spires reaching toward storm clouds that seemed perpetually gathered around the supernatural fortress that had served as vampire civilization's heart for over 12 centuries. Sarah's breath caught as their convoy approached gates wrought from meteoric iron that had witnessed the rise and fall of human empires while vampire courts conducted their eternal politics within walls that pulsed with accumulated power from countless blood rituals and political ceremonies. Elena pressed her face against the bulletproof window with wonder that made Sarah's heart ache. Her daughter seeing fairy tale magnificence, where Sarah recognized the beautiful prison that had once held her captive through love and duty and supernatural bonds that transcended human understanding of marriage and commitment. The palace interior revealed itself as a breathtaking fusion of medieval grandeur and cutting-edge technology. Ancient tapestries depicting vampire history hanging beside holographic displays that monitored global supernatural activities in real time, while classical music echoed through corridors where immortal nobles conducted business via encrypted satellite communications. Sarah walked these halls as a stranger returning to a homeland that had never truly been hers, recognizing faces that had once bowed to her as queen, and now regarded her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to barely concealed hunger for the political spectacle her trial would provide. Marcus clung to her hand with white-knuckled desperation as vampire courtiers examined him with the clinical interest of weapons experts evaluating promising new technology, their ancient eyes cataloging his supernatural potential while completely ignoring his humanity and the terror radiating from his small frame. The throne room had been converted into a formal tribunal chamber where centuries of vampire law would determine Elena and Marcus's fate through proceedings that blended legal precedent with political theater designed to reinforce existing power structures while appearing to offer justice. Lucian moved through this environment with the fluid confidence of absolute authority, his dual roles as king and father, creating visible tension as he balanced his duty to vampire law against his growing paternal instincts that Sarah's desperate gamble had awakened. Victor commanded impressive support among traditional nobles who viewed Sarah's very existence as contamination of pure bloodlines, his faction presenting united opposition to legal innovations that might challenge the rigid hierarchy maintaining vampire civilization's stability. The formal charges against Sarah were read with ceremonial gravity that made her stomach clench with recognition of how thoroughly vampire law favored existing power structures over individual rights or parental protection. She stood accused of theft of royal blood, deception of the vampire crown, endangering supernatural secrecy, and corruption of pure bloodlines through human influence, each charge carrying potential sentences ranging from exile to immediate execution depending on the tribunal's interpretation of ancient precedents. The legal framework governing hybrid children proved frustratingly vague, written during eras when such offspring were so rare that detailed regulations seemed unnecessary to vampire legislators who assumed pure bloodlines would always dominate supernatural reproduction. Sarah's academic research into the Crown of Choice statute represented her only hope of establishing legal precedent that might protect Elena and Marcus from being treated as valuable property rather than children deserving of choice and protection. The trial commenced with Victor's presentation of evidence documenting Sarah's systematic deception and the supposed damage caused by raising royal vampire children in human ignorance of their supernatural heritage and political responsibilities. His witnesses included ancient nobles who testified about the importance of bloodline purity and early supernatural education in maintaining vampire civilization's delicate balance between hidden influence and open warfare with human governments. Victor argued with passionate conviction that half-human children lacked the strength and moral clarity necessary for vampire leadership, their mixed heritage creating internal conflicts that would weaken supernatural society when it faced inevitable challenges from human technology and changing global politics. The prosecution presented Elena and Marcus as tragic examples of potential squandered through human weakness, arguing that their delayed supernatural education had already compromised their ability to fulfill their royal destiny and protect vampire interests against future threats. Sarah's defense team, led by the ancient counselor Elisande, whose vampire lineage predated most European civilizations, countered with historical evidence of successful hybrid leadership throughout supernatural history that traditional factions preferred to forget or minimize. Elisande presented documentation of vampire-human partnerships that had strengthened rather than weakened supernatural courts during periods of significant human technological advancement, her research revealing patterns of successful integration that challenged fundamental assumptions about bloodline purity and political effectiveness. The defense argued that Sarah's choice to raise Elena and Marcus with human values and perspective had created unique advantages rather than disadvantages, giving them insights into human psychology and social development that pure vampire children could never possess. Sarah herself testified about her academic discovery of the Crown of Choice law and her belief that children deserve the right to determine their own supernatural destiny, rather than having roles imposed upon them by circumstances of birth they could not control. Her words carried the passionate conviction of a mother defending her children's right to choose their own path, but also the scholarly authority of someone who had spent years researching vampire legal history with academic rigor that impressed even hostile tribunal members. Elena's testimony provided the most compelling moment of the trial, as she spoke with remarkable eloquence about wanting to understand both sides of her heritage before making important decisions about her future responsibilities and relationships. Her young voice carried natural authority as she explained that being part human and part vampire meant she could help both communities understand each other better, rather than viewing their differences as insurmountable obstacles to cooperation and mutual benefit. Marcus's testimony took a different approach as he simply asked why he couldn't just be a regular kid who played with toys and went to school and didn't have to worry about political responsibilities he didn't understand or want. His innocent question cut through centuries of legal complexity to highlight the human cost of treating children as political assets rather than individuals deserving of childhood and gradual introduction to adult responsibilities. The trial took a dramatic turn when Serafina revealed evidence that Victor had orchestrated several attacks on Sarah's family, including the magical assault that had forced her temporary blood bond with Lucian and the federal investigation that had destroyed their human sanctuary. Her testimony documented Victor's systematic campaign to destabilize Sarah's guardianship while positioning himself as the children's protector, revealing political manipulation that violated vampire laws governing fair treatment of royal family members. The revelation sent shockwaves through the tribunal as ancient nobles reassessed their support for Victor's faction, recognizing that his methods had endangered supernatural secrecy and threatened to expose vampire society to human investigation. Victor's attempted defense that his actions were necessary to protect vampire interests fell flat when Serafina presented recordings of private conversations where he discussed using Elena and Marcus as weapons in his own bid for increased political power. During a recess that was supposed to allow tribunal members to discuss the evidence presented, Victor's most radical supporters made their fatal mistake by attempting to kidnap Elena and Marcus from their secured chambers within the palace itself. The attack triggered the children's most dramatic display of supernatural power, as stress and danger activated abilities that exceeded anything previously recorded in vampire history or human imagination. Elena's empathic powers exploded outward to encompass every vampire in the castle simultaneously, overwhelming ancient immortals with shared emotions that included her terror, Marcus's panic, and Sarah's desperate love for her children. The psychic connection forced vampires throughout the palace to experience the children's perspectives directly, feeling their confusion and fear and innocent desire for safety and family rather than political power and supernatural responsibility. Marcus's defensive response proved even more spectacular as he unconsciously phased the entire Obsidian Palace out of normal space-time, creating a supernatural bubble where the ancient fortress existed in temporal isolation that prevented anyone from entering or leaving until his panic subsided. The combined power display lasted only minutes, but left every vampire in the palace fundamentally shaken by experiencing abilities that transcended traditional categories of supernatural strength and political influence. Ancient nobles, who had lived for millennia, found themselves questioning basic assumptions about vampire power and bloodline inheritance as they processed the implications of children who could manipulate supernatural bonds and temporal reality through emotional responses rather than trained magical techniques. The demonstration forced a complete recalculation of what Elena and Marcus's choice between human and vampire life might mean for supernatural society, as their unprecedented abilities suggested they could reshape vampire civilization regardless of which world they ultimately chose to embrace. Victor's kidnapping attempt backfired catastrophically as tribunal members recognized that his faction's desperation to control the children proved their political value while highlighting the dangers of treating them as property rather than individuals deserving of protection and choice. The trial reconvened in an atmosphere of profound uncertainty as both traditional and progressive factions grappled with evidence that Elena and Marcus possessed power that could either strengthen vampire society beyond imagination or destroy it completely depending on how their unique abilities were guided and developed. Sarah watched ancient immortals struggle to comprehend her children's potential while recognizing that the crown of choice law had become less about legal precedent and more about fundamental questions regarding the future of supernatural civilization itself. Lucian's expression revealed his own internal conflict as he balanced his roles as vampire king, protective father, and former mate to a woman whose desperate gamble had created possibilities that no one had anticipated or prepared to handle. The tribunal faced an unprecedented situation where traditional vampire law proved inadequate to address hybrid children, whose very existence challenged basic assumptions about bloodline inheritance, political succession, and the relationship between supernatural and human worlds. Elena and Marcus had become living symbols of transformation that threatened to reshape vampire society, regardless of whether they chose to embrace their supernatural heritage or reject it in favor of human lives that might no longer be possible given their demonstrated abilities. The trial's outcome would determine not just their personal fate, but the direction of vampire civilization as it faced an uncertain future where the old certainties of bloodline purity and traditional hierarchy might no longer provide adequate guidance for supernatural survival and prosperity. The crystalline silence that settled over the obsidian chambers following the High Council's withdrawal stretched like gossamer threads across centuries of tradition. Each tick of the ancient chronometer marking moments that could reshape supernatural civilization or condemn Sarah's children to fates determined by political expedience rather than justice or love. Sarah sat rigidly in the appointed waiting chamber, her academic mind cataloging the intricate carvings that adorned walls built from volcanic glass and mortal suffering, while Lucian paced with predatory restlessness that spoke to anxieties he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Elena curled in an oversized chair that had once seated vampire queens, her small form dwarfed by furniture designed for immortal nobility, while her empathic abilities unconsciously reached toward the council chambers where ancient minds deliberated her future with clinical detachment. Marcus remained pressed against Sarah's side, his ability to phase between dimensions flickering unpredictably as stress overwhelmed his young control systems, causing him to occasionally become translucent before snapping back to full visibility with startled gasps. The weight of expectation hung heavy as mountain mist, as vampire courts across continents awaited word of proceedings that would establish precedent for centuries of supernatural law, while human governments remained blissfully unaware that their world's future hung in balance of decisions made by immortal beings in chambers that existed outside national sovereignty. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, until Elena finally broke the oppressive quiet by addressing her brother directly, her voice carrying newfound maturity, born from witnessing political machinations and supernatural violence that had transformed her understanding of family and identity. "Marcus," she said softly while reaching for his flickering hand, "what do you really want when they ask us to choose? Because I think maybe we don't have to pick just one thing like they keep saying we do." Her question opened floodgates of conversation that had been building since their first glimpse of vampire society revealed both its magnificent power and its terrible cost. Two children processing trauma and possibility with wisdom that surprised even their supernatural father. Marcus spoke haltingly about his growing ability to help other hybrid children he had met during court proceedings, youngsters caught between worlds who lacked guidance in controlling abilities that marked them as dangerous anomalies in societies designed around purity and conformity. He wanted to create safe spaces where children like them could learn without being treated as weapons or aberrations. Marcus explained with earnest intensity that made Sarah's heart ache with maternal pride and recognition of his fundamental kindness. Elena admitted her fascination with vampire power and the sense of purpose that came from being part of something larger than individual concerns, but confessed her terror of losing the human connections that had shaped her early understanding of compassion and moral responsibility. The conversation revealed that both children understood instinctively what adults had failed to recognize through centuries of political maneuvering, that their hybrid nature represented opportunity rather than compromise, strength rather than contamination, potential rather than dangerous aberration. Their discussion continued through the long night as they explored possibilities that transcended traditional vampire hierarchy and human limitations, imagining futures where their unique abilities could bridge supernatural and mortal worlds rather than forcing impossible choices between them. Sarah listened with growing amazement as her children demonstrated wisdom beyond their years, recognizing that their experiences straddling two incompatible realities had given them perspectives that pure vampire or pure human offspring could never achieve independently. Dawn approached with mountain stillness when the council chambers finally opened to reveal Elder Morgana Blackthorn, her ancient face bearing expressions that defied easy interpretation as she gestured for the family to return to formal proceedings that would determine Elena and Marcus's destiny. The High Council had reconvened in full ceremonial regalia, their immortal faces masks of judicial authority, as they prepared to announce decisions that had required all-night deliberation among vampires whose combined experience spanned millennia of supernatural governance. Elder Blackthorn's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as she began reciting formal conclusions reached through careful consideration of legal precedent, political necessity, and the unprecedented nature of abilities that Elena and Marcus had demonstrated during testimony. The crown of choice statute was upheld in its essential form, she announced with ceremonial gravity, but modified to reflect unique circumstances presented by hybrid children whose powers transcended traditional categories and conventional expectations. Elena and Marcus would be granted extended consideration period lasting until their 18th birthdays, during which they would experience equal time in both supernatural and human societies while developing full understanding of their heritage and abilities. Sarah felt relief flood through her as the council continued outlining arrangements that would allow her children to grow and develop their own identities before making final choices about their supernatural destiny and political allegiance. Lucian was granted joint custody rights that acknowledged his paternal authority while respecting Sarah's role as primary guardian who had successfully protected and nurtured the children during their formative years. The council's decision included formal pardoning of Sarah's deception regarding her death and theft of royal blood, recognizing her actions as maternal protection rather than criminal betrayal of vampire law and royal prerogative. Victor faced immediate consequences for his unauthorized attacks and attempts to subvert legal proceedings through violence and intimidation, his traditional supporters finding themselves politically isolated by court decisions that prioritized legal process over bloodline privilege. The revolutionary aspects of the verdict became clear, as Elder Blackthorn outlined new precedents established for future hybrid children, creating legal framework that would allow supernatural courts to acknowledge mixed heritage as strength rather than contamination. Vampire society would begin gradual reforms in its relationship with human world, the council announced with careful precision, recognizing that continued secrecy required cooperation rather than domination over mortal institutions and governments. The formal proceedings concluded with ceremonial language that transformed Elena and Marcus from disputed assets into recognized heirs with unprecedented autonomy over their supernatural development and future choices. Sarah found herself weeping with relief and gratitude, as ancient vampires who had seemed impossibly remote and terrifying revealed capacity for wisdom and justice that transcended political expedience and traditional prejudice. Lucian's expression combined parental pride with royal satisfaction as he witnessed his children receive recognition and protection that would allow them to develop their unique abilities without pressure or manipulation from competing factions. The return journey to human territory carried entirely different emotional weight as family members processed their victory and began planning for futures that would honor both parts of their complex heritage. Elena chattered excitedly about upcoming adventures in vampire courts, balanced with continued education in human schools, while Marcus quietly made plans for helping other hybrid children navigate similar challenges with support and understanding, rather than fear and isolation. Years flowed past like gentle rivers carrying precious cargo as Elena and Marcus grew into their roles as bridges between supernatural and human societies, their unique abilities developing under careful guidance that respected their choices and individual personalities. Elena's empathic powers evolved into sophisticated diplomatic tools, that facilitated unprecedented cooperation between vampire courts and human institutions. Her natural charisma and genuine compassion, making her invaluable mediator in conflicts that had previously seemed irreconcilable. Marcus established discrete educational networks for hybrid children throughout North America and Europe. His patient teaching methods and protective instincts, creating safe havens where youngsters could master their abilities without becoming tools in supernatural political struggles. Sarah and Lucian rebuilt their relationship on foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose rather than the passionate obsession that had characterized their original marriage, their partnership strengthening through challenges faced together as parents and leaders. The 10th birthday celebration took place in both vampire courts and their renovated human home, symbolic of integration rather than division that had defined Elena and Marcus's unique upbringing and supernatural heritage. Sarah watched her children blow out candles surrounded by friends from both worlds, vampire nobility mingling with human classmates in harmony that would have been impossible without her children's bridging influence and diplomatic abilities. Elena demonstrated her latest empathic innovations by helping a young werewolf communicate with vampire delegates about territorial disputes, her natural talent for understanding multiple perspectives, creating breakthrough negotiations that established new models for supernatural cooperation. Marcus worked quietly with three newly discovered hybrid children whose abilities had manifested traumatically, his gentle approach and practical teaching methods providing guidance that prevented potential disasters while building confidence and control. Lucian stood beside Sarah as they observed their children's natural leadership emerging through service rather than domination, their relief and pride evident in shared glances that spoke volumes about parental love transcending political necessity. The celebration continued into evening as supernatural and human guests discovered common ground through Elena and Marcus's unconscious ability to create harmony among seemingly incompatible groups and worldviews. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate flight to triumphant integration, recognizing that her children had achieved something she never could have imagined when she first faked her death to protect them from supernatural politics. The evening concluded with quiet family time as Elena and Marcus shared their dreams for expanding their work with hybrid children while maintaining connections to both communities that had shaped their understanding of identity and purpose. Representatives from other supernatural communities approached throughout the celebration, werewolf packs and fae courts seeking similar recognition for their own hybrid offspring who face discrimination and isolation in societies designed around species purity. Sarah realized that her children's victory had opened doors for supernatural reform that extended far beyond vampire politics, creating precedent that could reshape relationships among all supernatural beings and their human neighbors. The future stretched ahead bright with possibility, as Elena and Marcus continued growing into leaders who chose their own destinies, rather than accepting roles imposed by others' expectations or ancient prejudices, their hybrid nature finally recognized as gift rather than curse.